three groups imagined the future for Black Americans: the Republican Party in Congress, Southern whites, and freed slaves themselves. So in this part of the video, I'm going to talk to you about these three groups and their visions for Black Americans and what their visions of freedom were for former slaves. Let's talk about the Republicans. So Lincoln's political party, the Republicans, were a market-oriented party. Thomas Jefferson articulated the agrarian idea of freedom. Freedom as based on land ownership or economic independence. This ideal was never achieved in the U.S., but it was widely believed, and the region with the highest rate of land ownership in 1860 was the upcountry non-slave South. This need for economic power and land ownership was seen in a couple of the documents that we're going to talk about for this week in class. Republican conceptions of the market, by contrast, were based on the idea that the market is something you enter of your own free will and where you have control over your actions. Freedom, then, derived from this choice. So Republicans believed that to the extent that people can enter into contractual relationships, they are free. To the extent that they cannot, they are slaves. So emancipation ends the buying and selling of human beings, but freedom is now defined in terms of buying and selling labor. So after the Civil War, we see a switch from the idea of freedom as based in land ownership to one in which freedom is based in your ability to sell your own labor to whomever you wish. Now, free people are those who can sell their labor or buy the labor of others. So that's the Republican Party vision. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about presidential Reconstruction, because that's going to get us into Southern whites' vision for what they thought freedom should be for former slaves after the Civil War. So Andrew Johnson follows the 10% plan that Lincoln had sketched out. And the 10% plan is that when 10% of Southerners, aside from a long list of those excluded, took an oath of loyalty, the state could come back into the Union. So once 10% of Southerners in a state took an oath of loyalty, they could come back into the Union. Almost all of the property confiscated from white Southerners is returned. No Southerners are forced into exile. Johnson pardons over 13,000 people to allow Confederates back into politics and public life, and Southerners' civil rights are very quickly restored. But Southern whites are not satisfied with the lenient measures granted to them under presidential Reconstruction. They respond with violence. There is incredible violence against ex-slaves. Whites lash out at blacks and whites who assist them in resisting white dominance. The KKK is established in 1866 in Tennessee. Between 1865 and 1868, there are more than 1,000 murders of blacks by whites in Texas alone. There were 500 indictments and 0 convictions. Northerners fear that the South will reestablish slavery. New Southern governments refuse to recognize that slavery is really gone for good, and they talk of reinstating slavery. The Southerners respond with the Black Codes. The Black Codes are passed by Southern states in the summer of 1865. So all 7 states that were readmitted under President Johnson's liberal and very lenient plan imposed these new codes. They are an American apartheid. They define African Americans as agricultural employees who can't do anything else. If an African American is found without labor, he or she can be fined or hired out to a plantation. Blacks need passes to enter towns. Black children can be taken from their parents and given to whites until they turn 21 years of age. Okay? And this, you read the Mississippi Black Codes, part of them, for class this week, so we will talk about those when we see each other as well. So that is a Southern white response. They respond with violence. They think that there should be a restriction on black movement, and they talk of reinstating slavery. So radical Reconstruction takes place after presidential Reconstruction because Northerners look at what's going on in the South and they begin to wonder what the war was fought for. In 1866, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act. It defines freedom and citizenship and civil liberties. It guarantees citizenship to black people. All people born in the United States, except for Native Americans, take a moment to let the irony sink in on that one, are considered U.S. citizens. The Act guarantees equal rights under the law, and it says that there is a duty it's the duty of the federal government to intervene within the states when necessary to enforce these rights. This is a revolutionary extension of federal power. The federal government can intervene within the states when necessary to enforce these civil rights. Essential to these rights is the freedom of contract. Now, to ensure the constitutionality of the Civil Rights Act, Congress, because Congress was worried about it being thrown out by the Supreme Court, they pushed for it to become an amendment. And it does. It becomes the 14th Amendment to the Constitution in 1868. There was also a belated punishment of Confederate leaders. All people who had made an oath of allegiance to the U.S., like when you join the Army or you take up an office in government, etc., all the folks who did that and then joined the Confederacy were excluded from holding office. It was about 25,000 people. Almost all of them, though, are pardoned by 1870. And there's a condition of readmission. I like this one. In order to get back into the Union and have their representatives recognized, Southern states have to ratify the 14th Amendment. So the Southern states that fought to preserve slavery and its Western expansion have to ratify the amendment saying that black people are U.S. citizens in order to get back into the Union. Okay. So as mentioned, Johnson pardoned 13,000 Confederates, which the Republicans refer to as a mockery of justice, and they react by trying to impeach him, but they don't remove him. So they impeach him, but they don't remove him. The Republicans who joined the Democrats to vote for acquittal didn't believe in using impeachment as a political weapon. Okay? That's much like Clinton in the 90s, which we'll talk about later. The people who voted for acquittal didn't believe in using impeachment as a political weapon. Let's talk about former slaves and their conception of freedom. Northern whites tried to convince slaves that freedom of contract and self-ownership are freedom. However, most freed slaves continued to hold to another conception of freedom, the older Republican Jeffersonian conception that I mentioned earlier, which emphasized control of property and independence, so land ownership as freedom. Ex-slaves and some Republican leaders, including Thaddeus Stevens, believe that economic independence, meaning land ownership, is freedom. Stevens and many slaves argue that slave owners' estates should be broken up and that they should get 40 acres and a mule as a share for the work they did in slavery. In fact, a group of former slaves petitioned President Andrew Johnson to keep the land that they had been given that belonged to Confederate slave owners in South Carolina, which we read that petition and we will talk about it in class this week. Former slaves critique the idea and concept of contractual freedom. They realize that if all they have is their labor, they have no more choice about whether or not to work than if they were slaves. If all you have is your labor, you either work or you starve. Planters set up contracts that reinstated many of the old aspects of slavery. Slaves can't leave the plantation without permission. Slaves must submit to punishment. Slaves must work in gangs. These are all things that are on the contracts for sharecropping, which we'll talk about in a minute. Slaves realize that if they're going to end up working for their former masters, picking cotton again, so they seek the best deals that they can that still allow them the chance to own land, which we'll talk about sharecropping in just a minute. So what did freedom mean to ex-slaves? Well, initially, freedom released slaves from the oppressions of violence, both physical and sexual, the trauma of broken families, and the inability to take part in everyday life outside of plantations, including education and legal marriage. Ex-slaves mostly voted with their feet, exercising their newfound freedom of movement. Roads of the South were filled with freed people on the move. They were searching for lost relatives. Think about it. Families sold down the river years before, and they were looking for new jobs in different places. A Florida planter wrote to his cousin in North Carolina, quote, "The Negroes don't seem to feel free unless they leave their old homes, just to make it sure they can go when and where they choose," end quote. So let's talk about the 15th Amendment. And then after we get through our discussion of the 15th Amendment, we'll end part 2 and we'll go to part 3. All right. So the 15th Amendment. In 1868, Ulysses S. Grant was elected president by a narrow margin of 300,000 votes. Republican leaders knew that almost 500,000 African Americans had voted for Grant, and they wanted to secure black suffrage not only as a definition of freedom for former slaves, but as a way to strengthen their own political party. Think about it. If 500,000 people are voting for your party, you're going to want to make sure it's legal for them to vote. In early 1869, Congress sent the 15th Amendment to the states for ratification. The provisions were very conservative. Suffrage could not be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. With these narrow requirements, property and literacy limitations could and would legally be imposed on blacks in southern states. Women activists saw Reconstruction as the moment for women to claim their rights, but encountered the limits of the Reconstruction commitment to equality. Advocates for women's suffrage, such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who had worked for years to have a constitutional amendment, were disappointed in the lack of gender inclusion in the 15th Amendment. Of women's suffrage, Stanton said, quote, "We are in the midst of a social revolution, greater than any political or religious revolution that the world has ever seen. This is women's transition period from slavery to freedom," end quote. Many politicians did not believe women had a place in politics, and others felt that securing rights for former slaves was more pressing. The feminist movement divided into those like Anthony and Stanton, who were bitterly disappointed and severed their ties with the abolitionist movement, and those who, while disappointed, still urged ratification of the 15th Amendment. The division within the feminist movement was felt until the splintered groups reunited in the 1890s. So the feminist movement split for 3 decades over the 15th Amendment. The destruction of slavery led feminists to search for ways to make the promise of free labor real for women. A new women's rights journal, The Agitator. These women's rights journals throughout history have excellent names. This is not the only one that I will talk about. So The Agitator carried stories complaining of the limited job opportunities and unequal pay for females who entered the labor market. Other feminists, including Stanton, demanded liberalized divorce laws, which then required evidence of adultery, desertion, and extreme abuse to terminate a marriage. Notice the word extreme abuse. Women also wanted control over their own bodies in regards to protection against domestic violence and access to what later generations would call birth control. However, Reconstruction left the gender boundary firmly intact. Women who tried to use the new constitutional amendments in court found their audience unreceptive. And we'll talk about the document by Stanton in class this week. So that's the end of part 2. Part 3, we are going to talk about the end of Reconstruction and, what might happen in the South as we go forward in time and the nation as a whole.